what this interview did was, because of the way you handled it, we got right into the really
Tricky
uh,
topics.
yeah, I mean, it's, and some of the questions that you would have asked me, I would normally say to somebody, well, no, I don't think I answer it, not even because I'm worried about it. It's just that that's kind of my business on this thing or whatever. But I do feel that, when I'm talking to you, I mean, I admire very much the kind of interviews that you did. And, when I hear things like Tommy Robinson and Farag and stuff, it's like, this is when you know your country has a problem. That
Hmm.
these people they've been around and they're still coming out of the woodwork again. They're actually, as you know, there are now articles saying that the current prime minister now has a challenge coming from the right.
Yeah,
That, you know what I mean? That this fellow who was seen as somehow now in the distance may emerge and be a significant political player.
The Inspire Us podcast.
hello.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, and nice to meet you. I'm Alex.
I'm Dara.
Okay. Good. Good to see you.
Yeah.
Well, I guess we can jump right into it. We're calling you from London. We're based in London. And I wonder if you saw there were protests that happened here this weekend. They had the Unite the Kingdom march that organized by a character called Tommy Robinson. Did you see that?
No, I heard about it, but yeah.
Yeah, so it was a built-up march, and this person, Tommy Robinson, he's a spokesperson for kind of the right of England, but nationalism in England, and he talks a lot about or recently Muslim rape gangs and kind of the culture battle there is between, the Muslims and the Christians here. And so we actually attended the protest and talked to some people to see how they feel, but we're happy to talk to you today. I feel like you're the perfect person to dive deep into these problems that we feel so much here in England. So thank you for joining us. So
Yeah, he's been around for quite a while, and and winds up making accusations that are incredibly false. He's a classic example of Islamophobia or anti-Muslim racism. They trade on what sometimes is referred to as the Great Replacement sort of theory, i.e., this sense of a white country, as it were, and that's going to be replaced by people of color, by foreigners, by immigrants, etc. And unfortunately, if this were,
hello,
Hello, John.
yeah, I think my screen just froze on you.
Hmm.
no worries. You were saying,
Yeah, I mean, I think that what we're saying and seeing is a situation that, for example, the attitude when I got into the field years and years ago, um, initially there was no big issue, but then what you wind up seeing developing in the late 1990s, certainly, and in fact, it was you had at the time a study that was commissioned and wasn't dealing with anti-Muslim racism or Islamophobia. But what it discovered in this national survey was the emergence of this phenomenon in the UK, and they used the word Islamophobia, and that's where we we in a sense got that word. And I triggered to that phenomenon in a book that I call The Islamic Threat, Myth, or Reality, which went through a number of editions in the 1990s. And so what the reason why I'm bringing this up as an example is that, here we are so many decades later, and the phenomenon is not only there, but
Hmm.
it's broader. The idea that, and as you would know, being in London, the idea that at times you have people who wind up denouncing the mayor of London, who happens to be a Muslim or has a Muslim name, and winds up denouncing him and using provocative kind of language just because of that, you know. And
Hello, John.
back
Back.
back again. I don't know
Again.
what's happening with the internet right now.
That's okay.
Yeah, no worries about it. I mean, you mentioned your book, the Islamic threat, myth or reality. And now that we're in 2025, is it a myth or is it reality? And if you ask many of those people who attended that protest and or are Tommy Robinson supporters, they will say that it's an obvious reality to them. And they often say things such as the Muslim world or like Islam doesn't work with our society here. And what do you think? And they don't never give maybe concrete examples, but what do you think they mean when they say that?
I think that basically that what you have is to begin with, an anti-foreign mentality, and anti-foreign, anti-immigrant. But Islam stands out in that it is, or Muslims, because they are a significant minority, within the UK. Also, what they trade off is incidents that occurred, such as 9/11 and 7/7, etc. And they don't isolate that situation in terms of, if you actually look at the global Muslim community, and you would see that you're talking about a fraction of a fraction, of 1% of that kind of militant Muslim, etc. So they key off that, and in fact, uh, they also play to the fact that in many societies, we see this in America, etc. There is a reaction that is broader than being just anti-Muslim. It's being anti-immigrant. It's being anti somebody who is not white, etc. But this becomes a kind of key flashpoint for them, and the reality of it is that there we have people with that kind of mentality, and then it winds up leading to violence. And sometimes you can have a situation where the very people who espouse this kind of attitude themselves become victims of violence. So, the hard fact is that, for example, a number of years ago, I worked with the Gallup organization, and we did a book called "Who Speaks, for Islam: What a Billion Muslims Really Think," and this was a global effort on the part of Gallup, and the clear evidence that came across was a demonstration that the vast majority of Muslims are like the vast majority of a lot of other people. They're very diverse, and you have people who belong to a faith, and those that follow the faith, those that are identified with the faith, just simply because of their background or their family history. But in fact, when you actually looked at what a billion Muslims were thinking, you could see that we're not talking about a religion that is specifically any more violently driven than any other. A fair number of people, for example, in the United States, who are on the far right and militant and anti-Muslim, are themselves far right Christians, whose form of Christianity, and somehow in the name of Christ, which is difficult for me to believe. I'm trained in Christianity, both in terms of my early personal life as well as my early degrees. I was with the Capuchin Franciscans for a number of years, intending to be a Capuchin Franciscan priest, for example. So, I come out of that background. I also then was a young Catholic theologian for many years during the time of the civil rights movement, the march on Washington at the time, the Vietnam War. I, I have that knowledge of Christianity, and I also have that knowledge of Islam. And in fact, if you look at the question of violence in many religions, the violence often occurred more in a situation where rulers or government leaders used religion to divide people. So, for example, take the Crusades. Hmm? You had the Pope saying Deus vult, God wills it, but the Pope was legitimating and trying to demonstrate that he had a greater authority than even the emperors. But in fact, much of the Crusades was an imperial war, if you will, that was seeking land and to spread, um, you know, as it were, the political venue, of the ruler. The same thing happens in the Muslim world historically, where you wind up with either rulers using religion in the past, or today movements using religion, that is militant movements, and what that can do is play into those people who are racist and militant. They take those actions that occur and they generalize about it. If you look, for example, even as a more contemporary example, the recent assassination of the 31-year-old on the conservative or ultra conservative side, person. The fact is, what then happens when that happens is that people begin to say, oh, it's the left that's responsible for that. Because he's on the right, when in fact it's a good deal of the right that's been responsible for the militant language that we have seen in violence in our country, and even the militant language, or if you will, rejectionist kind of language of administrations. The first Trump administration, the current Trump administration. President Trump has made statements from the first time that he was president, that basically brushstroked Islam and the vast majority of Muslims. And that emerges in a good deal of what's happening now, when in this anti-immigrant, an awful lot of Muslims who are in that category. So it's not surprising. It's a world in which we're living now, which is, when you look at a country, you don't just say, well, that's a new phenomenon in Britain. No, it's been existing for decades. But it's also, this phenomenon is in France, in Germany. You can go right across Austria, Spain at times.
Yeah. And on that topic of the rise of Islamophobia in the UK, if you speak to someone who's very fervently against Islam, they pull out quotes from the Quran and say, listen, in the Quran it says that they're going to take over, or that they want the destruction of is it kufir, the non-believer.
Yeah, the non-believer.
Obviously, I'm not very well versed in like my Quran text, so I don't have any rebuttal. There's nothing I can say. I can say, hey, that's taken out of context. I don't really know. So I think part of the issue perhaps is, the Quran is taken out of context or misinterpreted and people just run along with it. Do you know specifically those typical quotes that are taken out of context or misinterpreted, or could you shine more light on that topic?
Well, I mean, they'll take a phrase, for example, like "slay the unbelievers wherever you find them." Okay, that was in the context in which the early Muslim community was being persecuted, if you will, by the Meccans, and so, in other words, you're being told that you can fight against that which is attacking you. But if you continue to look at the quotations in the Quran, it basically indicates that when you stop being threatened, when somebody's not threatening to kill you, then that militant response is not called for. You can do that with scriptures. If you take the Bible, for example, and if you take if you will, the Old Testament, or if you want to refer to it as the Hebrew Bible, etc., you have several instances in which violence is in which God commands violence.
Mm.
And very often the very Christian right that often are talking about militant Muslims aren't looking at their own scriptures, and seeing how those scriptures can be interpreted. And we see that occurring today. You have, for example, the Israeli government, members of the Israeli government, of the cabinet, that have a very militant approach in their interpretation with regard to Israel and Palestine.
Mm.
And they will quote from their scriptures, take that out of context and use that as an excuse for basically saying that this land is simply Israel is to be a totally Jewish state, and the other is the enemy. And then they'll cite examples from centuries before, from text in the Old Testament, to legitimate what they're calling for. So, for example, more recently, you have at least one or two members of the cabinet that have actually said that starvation is a legitimate vehicle. That the whole idea is to all Palestinians are bad, all Palestinians should be cut out, that Israel should only be a Jewish state, and that it's not only that you can use the military, but you can use starvation or anything else, and using religion to do that. Now, does that represent, if you will, mainstream Judaism? No, but it does represent a militant interpretation, and when it occurs in a certain political context, it can then take on more motivation. So, for example, again, the somewhat 1,250, 1,270 of innocent Israelis who were killed on October 7th become a legitimating factor for those that now have legitimated a war that's killed at least a minimum of 66,000 Palestinians, and used it as an excuse now to simply cleanse the land, as it were. So that's where religion can be used, and this goes for a number of faiths. If you look, for example, in Southeast Asia, you can have an example of where you have militant Buddhists. For example, in terms of the Rohingya situation, militant Buddhist monks, but they don't represent all of Buddhism or all Buddhist monks. Just the opposite. But that then becomes a legitimation. If you look at India today, and the extent to which the current government has declared India a religious state, much as Netanyahu did with regard to Israel as the Jewish state. And there's been an absolute persecution of Muslims and also of Christians by Hindu militants. Is that the heart of Hinduism? I would say no. Hinduism was one of the first non-Christian religions that I actually studied. So I think that what we're seeing is if you will, is simply the militarization and use of religion to legitimate both denouncing the other, as well as engaging in violence, with the other. You remember, I think it was last year when Netanyahu picked a particular word that comes out from the Old Testament, and a particular situation in which God commands action, and basically winds up saying that these people aren't really fully human. They're half animal and half human. And Netanyahu used that term, as did the more militant supporters, religious supporters that he has. That doesn't represent, what mainstream Jews, believe, historically, etc. But religion can be a potent factor.
Yeah, and it's not good to use the very extreme examples to sort of tar the whole religion with that brush for being violent and so on and so forth. And on that topic, another argument from those who are quite anti-Islam or quite anti-Islam is sort of free speech. There's some incompatibility with Islam and free speech. And in the UK, a big debate was around blasphemy laws. They say because of Islam, we start to get blasphemy laws, and there was a big kerfuffle with this man who burnt the Quran and he got beaten up. And I think we have independent MPs currently talking about blasphemy laws. So another talking point is that Islam is incompatible with freedom of speech.
You should mention that those MPs are Muslim.
Yeah, sorry. So those four independent MPs, they're also Muslim, and apparently they were discussing blasphemy laws, which, you know, for this country is something that is not done, and people were complaining about it. So yeah, that's another talking point. I just wondered how you see that, or if you think that's true, or is it just completely false? Or
Well, the fact is, for many believers of all faiths, for many Christians, blasphemy, for example, would be seen as offensive or unacceptable. That's different than saying that one is going to advocate that there be a law, against what would be called blasphemy. But are people offended? Whether they're Christians, Jews, or Muslims, when one is denouncing, one's faith, and there can be a move on that, and that can be also a problem when you do have a faith where you have a dominant religion historically. In other words, in Christian countries, or in, if you will, in Muslim countries. Here I'm talking about, where you've got government also, with that kind of representation. But, the idea of, of simply saying that there's something, peculiar about people being offended, and people not wanting to see a certain action taking place. That's one thing. If they want to say that they identify that they're in, let's say, among mainstream Muslims, that mainstream Muslims are somehow militantly, desirous of forcing and passing blasphemy laws, to suit their, there's no basis for that.
I guess the underlying point is to say that Islam has this underlying unacceptance that we have here in the West. They mention these Christian values where we accept free speech, and there's this feeling that, we're tolerant, and these guys that are not tolerant are going to come here and just take advantage of our kindness. But on this blasphemy point, like, for example, in France, I'm pretty sure they have blasphemy laws for the Jews. So is the blasphemy thing just necessarily Islam? Can it be applied to any religion? Yeah.
Historically, if one were to look at, for example, the history of Christianity, historically, certainly in Christian empires and Christian countries, blasphemy would have been unacceptable. And in many countries where you would have a predominant religion, historically in many of them, blasphemy would be unacceptable. Now, when you move to the modern state, as it were, or the modern democratic state, then you're in a different context. It's a different situation, where we emphasize, if you will, pluralism, political pluralism, as well as religious pluralism. So, if one wants to say, gee, there are conservative Muslims who would like to see a blasphemy law passed, because, well, there are conservative Christians that if it weren't that you wind up having a country that has a pluralistic government, or in terms of its laws and its regulations, you would wind up with some people who would like to see their faith not touched. You know, uh, uh, there's years and years ago, for example, when I was growing up, let's say in say America pluralistic, but years and years ago, if you had a film or an art exhibit that was seen as presenting Jesus in a very offensive way, okay, you would have had people who would have picketed the movie house. You would have had people who would, etc. Uh, and you would have people who would be, more, as it were, more visibly condemning these things. I remember when we talk about some of this, I remember talking to a close Muslim friend of mine who created and used to head a major Muslim organization in America. And we were talking, and he was talking about the way in which the Prophet Muhammad is vilified, you know, um, you know, by others. Okay, and he said to me, he said, I can't do that in return because Jesus is a prophet for me.
Mm.
Moses is a prophet. In fact, he said to me, I have a son named Isa, Jesus, and a son named Musa, Moses.
Mm.
So, you see, and yet in New York on some, on radio shows you might have heard, or in political, in other political venues, there would have been just an ignorance of this and just basically, a kind of militant interpretation. You can't, the danger is when you take what in fact are extremist actions or even extremist rhetoric, you can't make that necessarily representative for the vast majority of a population.
Mm.
And I think that too often is, what we see and what happens. And also, in the UK, I think that the situation can be, and in some other countries in the West, can be compounded by the fact that a significant number of the population are not are no longer Christian. It's many of the churches are empty or don't exist anymore, as compared to years ago. In other words, Christianity has become more and more invisible, if you will. Um, and that also can can create a situation where people who don't have a sense of history are not aware of or respectful for the fact that that for some people their religious practice is something that's important. I mean, take something like a woman covering her head, wearing a veil. What's the big problem? Nuns used to do this, and in fact, in some conservative Catholic countries in the old days, women when they would go to church, would wear like a head veil, you know. Uh,
They
but
still do here. They still do that.
yeah,
So,
but you have situations where these women, whether it's in the UK or the US, will have people shouting stuff at them. Occasionally, you'll see situations where they get roughed up, or somebody pulls the veil off, or if it's in France, it winds up having legislation that does not permit wearing a headscarf in a variety of contexts. Whether it's on a sports team or etc. In that kind of situation, is that representing some sort of secularism? I don't think so.
I mean, I guess that's in France's point, and I am French, so maybe I'm a little bit biased, but it feels like the secular thing is really a big thing. And like I have a family, so I'm half Tunisian as well, and my family is in France, and my grandma wears the scarf, and if it's fine. I think it's the full, but
The niqab.
yeah,
Yeah.
the full, because terrorism is a big problem. They're like, you can't cover your face. But France, I don't know, it feels somewhat more integrated. I know around the world you'll hear news that France is very racist but coming here, I studied here in the UK and now living here, it really feels like there's a much bigger separation between the Muslim world and the UK population. And I don't know what to do about it. Like, how do we unite the gap? And you were talking about how this, you have these small events that generalize the whole population. And we've seen that happen time and time again. 9/11 is a big one. And in the UK recently, a big one was the rape gangs. And obviously the rape gang, like I've never even heard about that was a thing. I didn't even know that existed. But apparently, yeah, maybe Dara, you know more information about it, but it's a little thing, and now it's being used to generalize the whole population, and it's a big motivator for the people who showed up to the march. Like, look at the Arabians. We need to protect our daughters, And to some extent, I agree. Of course, raping is wrong, and the government here, it created outrage because they voted on whether they would investigate it, and they didn't investigate it, and so that sparked outrage.
So I guess just to add on to what Alex says, and this is honestly why we really, really wanted to speak to you, because we feel like we do need to bridge these two worlds together. There's so much animosity and hostility here between those groups, between the Brits, well, not Brits, but I'll just say indigenous Brits, for lack of a better term, and the Muslim population, and the rape gangs that really did sort of start this schism between the two, and it just keeps on getting worse and even more polarized. I guess a part of it is that the government's covered it up, and there was repeated instances of where they could have brought it to light, but they covered it up, and lots of people on the right said it's because they favored the Muslim population here, and they sort of really made those on the right really resentful about the government and towards the Islamic population. And as you said, we went to the Tommy Robinson March, and we could visibly, very tangibly see the effects of all of this. And I guess I just want to bridge the gap and just understand how we can uncover the truth about Islam instead of using these very extreme examples. And even when you say you're anti-Islam or you don't want Islam here, what does that mean? Do you mean the people? Do you mean you don't want mosques here? And also, there is the rise of Sharia courts here, and people are quite alarmed. So, do you just not want, and it's not forced, it's not integrated into the legal framework of the UK, but I think it's just for those communities who, I think, with disputes over marriages and whatnot, they have to go to a Sharia court to sort it out. So, I don't have to ever go to a Sharia court, or the normal British bloke wouldn't have to, but for those communities, it's there for them. So it's just clarifying, what do you even mean by anti-Islam? It's still not very clear. And there's just so many things that I think needed to be uncovered and clarified for people.
Yeah, well, the first thing is I don't live there. So I go to Britain, quite often. But on the question of the rape gangs, I mean, that's something that you'd be able to find the data, in terms of sorting that through. What I can say is following Britain for decades, but also following European countries. And if you go to bridge.georgetown.edu, you'll see we have we cover the issue of Islamophobia for the last 10 years with all kinds of examples. The reality of it is that some of the examples that you were just giving now, fear of Sharia, etc. This has been out there for, people don't even know what they're talking about. The religious law is not necessarily dangerous, whether it's Jewish law or it's Christian law. And Christianity has laws with regard to marriage and divorce, etc. At least a number of Christian churches would have that, and certainly Catholicism has had it, and that's it's not for the state to to interfere with that. When I was married, I was married in a Catholic church, and you had Catholic documentation, etc. And then that was worked out with the government, and that was acceptable. It wasn't as if somebody said, "Well, this is a Catholic marriage, and no, there should be a secular ceremony, and we're not going to, allow for that Catholic ceremony." And the concern about Sharia, most of the time, um, actually, I did a book called "What Everyone Needs to Know About Sharia" that Oxford University Press published. And the fact is, you do have Islamic law or Sharia law, and as in other religions, you have laws. Uh, and very often, uh, there's a kind of blind accusation that this is going to be imposed on the country. We had this back around the time when President Trump ran for his first presidency, and even a bit before that. Uh, you had people, saying that Sharia was going to be imposed in this country. Most of the people didn't even know what Sharia was. That is, the people that were saying this, the government officials that were saying this, they didn't know what it was. And there's no reason why somebody who is a believer, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, cannot they can live in a secular state in which there can be parts of their faith that for them are important in terms of how they marry, and whom they marry, or how they dress, how they choose to dress, etc. uh, and a lot of what is said, this kind of anti-Sharia, which spread increasingly a couple of decades ago in the United States, was just set off by a number of super right-wing anti-Muslim groups, along with prominent right-wing politicians, who would then imply that this was going to take over. You see, and, and then that leads to people being even more upset if one decides that a woman wants to dress from her perspective more Islamically and chooses to wear a veil or to wear a longer outfit or whatever. And I think that's once you demonize a religion, uh, then everything becomes possible. Every rumor becomes possible, or everything that is done becomes possible. You know, a minor kind of a silly little example was when I was a kid in my parents' generation. You married another Italian, and that would have meant Italian Catholic at the time. And I can remember my grandmother pointing out when we'd have like a Christmas celebration, and there would be five members of my father's family there, etc. But my grandmother pointing out and pointing to my Aunt Kitty and saying, "See what they're like? Notice how she's drinking, right?" Now, the guys were drinking, her husband was drinking, but this was, you know, and it was a stereotype, that all Irish people, or that most Irish people drink, or that etc. And I find that sometimes that's the kind of attitude that occurs, for example, with a woman wearing a hijab. Look at the professional women in the UK, and many of them I know, and the professional women I know in the US, in all kinds of professions, who wear a headscarf.
Mm.
And they can graduate from the best universities or hold terrific positions, but your Tommy Robinson, etc., will see this as a dangerous and offensive, you know, uh, situation, And I think that that's what we see at times, and it exists in French culture. I can remember a member of the royal family from one of the countries in the Gulf used to go to a very expensive restaurant, and the person who was also a senior member in the government of this Arab country. But all of a sudden, when the veil became an issue, was shocked when they were leaving, and the hostess said, and was kind of apologizing, but kind of said, "I'm afraid, in the future we won't admit a woman who's wearing a headscarf." I mean, this kind of, or the concern about a Muslim woman having a bathing suit that was okay for them, and there was a whole to do in France, and then we've even had issues when it comes to the Olympics and how Muslim women, should or shouldn't dress. This is absurd. I mean, it's just, I mean, it is, but the fact that we're still talking that way means that although our countries, European countries and certainly America, like to think, certainly when I was growing up, etc., that, here we were the countries that had developed in the 20th century into progressive, pluralistic, open societies. Okay. Well, how open are we when you look at the level of violence and discrimination that occurs, not only in the UK, but in Austria, Germany? As I said, you can go right across the board, and here we're talking about at times where government is intervening, okay? Let alone when you get into the question of violence being done. How do you legitimate the kinds of rhetoric, the rhetoric of a Tommy Robinson and others? It's a rhetoric that provokes. It not only distorts what the reality is, it provokes. Or what people do is, if you do have a member of a particular religion or whatever, and they do something that is violent or against things, they say, "See what they're like," or militant. I remember when I first went to the Middle East, to the Middle East Center for Arab Studies, which was a British training camp in Lebanon for their diplomats, but they also had outsiders that would go. The fellow that picked me up was really very nice. He was British, But as we were driving, he said, "Now be careful with these Lebanese drivers because they're very aggressive. And the fact is, you want to really be careful because they just may, stop and pull out a gun and shoot you."
Oh dear.
Stereotype. It's just, simply, a stereotype. And I think that's, if you really take a look at what we're dealing with, we're living in an even more dangerous, as far as I can see, an even more dangerous situation. I think it is it is important that that you have not only religious leaders, but that others speak out. But the first thing is just to know, what one is denouncing.
And I also think, so people look again at the extremes, and I think an example for me would be the Iranian regime. It's a theocratic, very authoritarian, just horrible regime. And I think people use the Islamic leaders as an idea of what the actual people are like. And when I actually met Iranians, they were so, I'd say that they're so just not religious. So I think they're quite liberal people. They're very nice, humble, sweet. None of the traits that you'd find in their horrible, horrible religious leaders. But people use the idea of what their religious leaders are to sort of paint the whole population as that. And I do think there's some discrepancy between what the people actually want and what the leaders impose on the people. So I don't think many Iranians want an Iranian regime. I think they want a very secular, democratic regime. But again, I don't think many people here in the West actually know that. And it goes back to even the Arab Springs. Like, clearly there's some desire for some democratic society. And people will always use Islamic regimes to portray the will of the people, and I think that's just not the case. So that was something which was quite eye-opening for me, is that there is a massive discrepancy between what the people want and the leaders of the country.
Yeah, I think that, when, for example, when you look at the Arab Spring, I mean, the fact is that if you look at Egypt and Tunisia, but also a number of other countries, but Egypt and Tunisia, you did see uh, uh, leaders that were democratically elected.
Mm.
And at the end of the day, when in fact Sisi engaged in a coup, that then was somehow accepted. The United States, for example, initially you had the reaction of Obama, the president, and then his Secretary of State, Clinton. And, one of them would say something like, we accept the will of the people. The other one would say, Mr. Mubarak's been a long and, cooperative friend. Mubarak was an autocrat. His prisons were full. Sisi came in, and what happened? Look at the violence that occurred initially and the thousands and thousands of people who were imprisoned, many of them who were members of the movement and died. And what was the problem? Because you actually had at a certain point Islamic movements that participated politically. They also were engaged in many of them. For example, in Egypt, they ran schools, they ran clinics, they ran lots of different. They provided lots of services. Now, if they're elected democratically, then that should be respected by Western countries. However, it was very easy for Western countries to accept the coups, and indeed in your own country, in and it's occurring again now. There are those that want to talk about outlawing the Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, I don't know what they think they're talking about.
I really wanted to speak to you about this because I think Farage had also called Starmer,
Yeah,
like he called him, like, well, I can't remember what he said exactly, but he just basically called him a coward for not banning the Muslim Brotherhood. And I don't think many people actually know what it is, including myself. I'm aware this is this movement in Egypt, and it had this contest with Nasser, and back and forth clearly. But I don't think many people truly know what it is. I think we just lump it in this category of Islamic fundamentalists who want to commit acts of terror. But I don't think many people know what they're talking about.
yeah. When I was there right after the coup in Egypt, and in fact, there is a volume that was put out by a law firm in the UK. I wrote the introduction to it on the question of who's the Muslim Brotherhood. What are they? What are they like, etc. Um, the Muslim Brotherhood was a democratically elected, government, and many of their people were very well educated, etc. Uh, have there been people who engaged in violence who were Muslim? Yes. Just have there been people who engage in violence who are Israeli Jews? Yes. If you're going to look and be concerned about the nature of the government, why isn't there just a denunciation of the current Israeli government, which has been found by international courts, etc., the UN, etc., as engaging in genocide? Now, should we then say when we're condemning it, rather than saying we're condemning Netanyahu or Israeli officials, should it be that we're condemning Jews and Judaism? No, you know. Um, but again, I think that and now you have that brought up again, in the UK, and the same situation has occurred in the US. There was an attempt uh, a number of years ago in which the the Senate and Congress were getting involved in hearings with regard to the Muslim Brotherhood. And the question of are there members of the Muslim Brotherhood in the United States, etc. Who's behind that? If you take a good look, in general, it's one or two authoritarian Arab regimes,
Mm.
and they're the people supporting this. And you know, it again, one needs to be, careful about what one is doing, and to bring up the examples that have occurred, in the last decade, a decade and a half, in which you've had militant Buddhists in a country, then driving out Muslims, slaughtering Muslims, or you've had the violence that's taken place in India. We don't brushstroke the whole religion, and if we were to brushstroke, for example, all of Israelis or Judaism for the genocide that the Netanyahu's existed in, the fact that he's now what in the last year gone in and felt free to bomb in eight different countries and do that killing. And should we be saying, well, it's a Jewish state? It declared itself Israel is a Jewish state, so that's what Judaism is about. That isn't what Judaism's about.
Mm.
That's not what the vast majority of Jews are about. You know, so I think that this we need to realize that in a variety of countries we have far right organizations that have grown up, and that they wind up for a variety of reasons feeling threatened by the other.
Mm.
And the reason for that is that, for example, in a number of European countries, to be whatever it meant to be Danish or Swedish or whatever meant that you were white, that you were Protestant in background, etc. And then suddenly uh, that's that's not there, and there's a sense that we're losing our identity. Again, it's this notion of the great replacement theory, and this is also what's behind a lot of the right-wing people here. That we are a white country. We were meant to be that. We're a white Christian country, many of them will say.
Mm.
And we need to see that for what it is. Unless we do, we'll continue to see the kind of violence that's taking place. And the danger is it will radicalize more and more people.
Do you know what sorry to interrupt you there, Alex, but do you know how I've sort of understood this? Because I think on both sides, so I think there are many Muslims who have some disdain for Western lifestyle. They see it as like unholy, or I don't know what's the best way to put it, as like quite
Like they feel they're
perverse.
lost.
Yeah, they feel like, they feel that Western lifestyle is quite perverse. But ultimately, for me, how I've sort of like understood it, and this could be wrong, I've sort of seen it as like perhaps the paranoia from the Crusades have never left. I mean, both sides have this fear of being taken over from the other side. I mean, that's also common in Islam. I do think they fear the West taking over. And I think historically, looking at all the Western interventions and how they've sort of completely decimated the countries, and now we're also seeing that same rhetoric here in the West. For me, it's like the paranoia of the crusade that lives on, all those conflicts, they've never really left. Do you think there's a part of that which is true?
Well, I, I think that if you have conservative, let's say conservative religious believers, okay, whether they're uh, Catholic, Protestant, Muslim, Jewish, Hindu, etc. If you put them in a context in which um, um, there's amores, that permits stuff that they don't agree with, they'll be upset about it,
Mm.
and I think they have a perfect right to. I mean, we do the opposite in the name of secularism.
Mm.
We wind up in the name of secularism, not just banning people in terms of their religion, but in terms of their sexuality, for example.
Mm.
Look at the way in which the transgender issue is or is not dealt with. So, in other words, what I'm saying is that, for example, the 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 Catholic mores, not only the Catholic belief, but the Catholic mores of, let's say, my grandparents, not all of that wasn't part of my completely part of my identity. But I they were conservative, relative, Roman Catholics too, and then that might have affected the way they would vote.
Mm.
And that could be true for a variety of folks of religion, but also the reverse. The so-called what? The so-called secular person who will not vote for a candidate who happens to be somebody of another religion just because they're of that religion, rather than looking at what are their political policies.
Mm.
Okay, we look, for example, today now in New York City, the mayor's race that's going to take place with Mr. Mamdani, you know, and it's going to be an interesting situation. And there are a number of leaders in the Democratic Party who have not supported him. Why? On the other hand, the governor of New York, I think I just noticed, is coming out, and others, and many think he may win. And that will be a really good example of somebody who, if you ask him, is he Muslim? I'm sure he'd say yes. If you ask him, does he pray? I would bet you that he would say that he does pray, etc. But the question is, when you're voting for somebody politically, what's the political policy that they have? Not whether or not they're religious. For rabid secularists, and I think there are secularists who are rabid secularists, who are fundamentalist secularists, they wouldn't vote for somebody who they thought was a believer. They, you know what I mean? The very fact that they were somebody who, and they would say that, well, this person's a devout Catholic or a devout whatever, or even instead of looking at what are the policies, the political policies, the social policies, within our society. If we're a pluralistic society, it means that we allow for pluralism. And the only time that that's a problem is if somebody is going up against pluralistic rights that people have. But I think the stereotype. I have friends who are a European and come from countries like France or the UK, and who are scholars who write on religion, etc. And some of them will say that their best friends will say, I don't understand how you can do that. Rather than, look, I'm a scholar, and hey, I also write some good books, and maybe I actually get a lot of media attention, make a good salary, maybe make more money than you do. What's the problem? But it'll be that attitude for somebody who really feels, wait a minute, I'm secular. This is a secular country, and so religion is always going to be an obstacle. Secularism can be, a rabid secularism becomes an obstacle when it attempts to deny the rights of people of faith to dress as they wish to dress, to be able to vote freely in a way that they want to vote, just as secular people should be able to vote freely. I think that's where it gets tricky. I think in my own country, where I see it is that we have an awful lot of what I would call militant Christian right. So in the name of Christianity, but the kinds of things that they wind up advocating when it comes to social policy and discrimination, from my point of view, it goes against what a pluralistic democracy should look like. And I think that the same thing needs to be said in terms of if one is talking about a country in Europe. Just because somebody has a different name or a different color, or they choose to dress or not, a bit differently, or they have a certain marital, attitudes, etc. This is what pluralism is about. Either that, or we wind up saying no. What we really think is the ideal is a secular, pluralistic country. That means no belief. And I think that's and I think the situation when it comes to tolerating religion becomes more um, noticeable, or it can, when in fact faith begins to disappear. When you don't, when people, when there aren't many examples, you know, uh, and people come to view pluralism and secular pluralism as really not including religion. A really bright person would not be a believer. And a really bright, you see, would not really be, and in fact, that makes them dangerous,
It
to
becomes almost its own
make.
religion.
Hmm?
It becomes almost its own religion.
That's right. And and again, if you see what happens, for example, in your country and some other countries where you actually have somebody who, let's say, is Muslim, but they're Muslim in name, they may not even practice their faith.
Mm.
But for your
That's a big
really
one, yeah.
Tommy Robinson types, you know, they'll look at the name. They'll look at, the skin color, and I think that's where uh, when I hear people say that, oh, people of, let's say, that some Muslims have committed violent crimes. Well, let's look at the crime rate in the UK.
Mm.
And how about all the other people that are committing, whether you're talking about theft, rape, or whatever, what are we talking about? I think you know, th that's what we have to think. If we don't think in this way, then we have a problem. If for a good deal of my career, certainly during the period post-Iranian Revolution, but particularly post 9/11, I got death threats, and I'm getting them what? From really nice people who would see themselves as part of the mainstream. And I'm not a Muslim, but they don't like what I write or say. But I've had death threats. I've had people, write articles criticizing me, etc. They have a perfect right to do that.
So,
But
John, what specifically did you say that like triggered this outrage? Was there one article or a book or
no,
just
no, it's um, it for some, it's um, Islam is an evil religion, or all Muslims are a problem. Um, you um, uh,
they're just annoyed that you're defending?
they think it's a defense. I mean, I'm just a scholar who writes about Islam,
Mm.
and I'm not the only person that has had that situation. And certainly it's existed in France. It exists there today. I know a first-rate French scholar. He's not a Muslim. He's lived in multiple uh, Arab countries as a great scholar. But has come under pressure at times and had threats, etc. Um, and this is within a pluralistic secular state. And really, what sometimes it is that people don't. I remember once doing an interview in New York with somebody who had a very successful radio show,
Mm.
and he brought up some example, from Islam, or of some Muslim who did something.
Mm.
And I said something like, "Well, let's take a look at so and so," and I mentioned somebody who was Jewish, and he happened to be Jewish, and he said, "Well, we're not. That's ridiculous. Why would we even talk about that?" Or when somebody says, "Gee, there's a passage in the Quran that says slay the unbelievers wherever you find them," and then if I were to say, "Look, in the Bible that I was raised with, and many people do, in terms of the Old Testament, you have situations when uh, where God basically wound up saying, you you did not do what I wanted, and now what you need to do is you should go and kill all living things."
Mm.
Okay. Okay. Uh, unless you contextualize that, if you just take that one example and you take it out of the context, is that then going to be something where you now dismiss Judaism,
Mm.
you dismiss Christianity? In other words, all the different Christian groups, all of whom see the Bible as their sacred scripture. And I think that a lot of it is the examples. I happen to be a great admirer of a number of Northern European countries. I've been there a number of times, etc. But I find it interesting that in a place like Sweden and others, you have burning of the Quran, and you have this Islamophobic rhetoric that even gets put into the newspapers when you have a small percentage of Muslims in those countries. But I think part of what they appeal to in that country, and it also refers to the UK historically, the sense of history in the UK, okay, is basically white countries,
Mm.
Christian countries, and you know what I mean? Everybody, so that was the context. And now you're in a situation where it's it's becoming more multi-religious, etc. And then there's that fear.
Mm.
And it's become the scapegoat. And that's what I found sad is that, there's obviously problems going on even in Sweden and France and the UK, but Islam has become a scapegoat. And, even as we were talking in the beginning of our conversation, it's like it's all bunched up together. One time it's migrants, but then they'll switch to focus on Islam,
Mm.
and so it's not really focused. It's just the other. And
Mm.
Islam has a really good or holds a monopoly over the other, in the
Mm.
UK and the West, and it's sad to see.
Because Alex and I were saying earlier that the anti-migrant rhetoric, it just mostly feels very anti-Islam. And
It's like, how would Tommy Robinson feel about like a Christian Nigerian, being a refugee to the UK?
but then I think he's spoken about this, and for the most part, he says there's nothing wrong with Christians coming from other countries because there are some congruence. But when it's Islam, you're going to have these problems. And to the extent that we've increasingly become this secular country, and religion has just lost its place in people's lives. But now you're getting people saying we need a Christian revival. We need to go back to the church. And
Yeah.
I do wonder, is it because people are rediscovering the compelling message of Christ? Or do you think it's just to counteract Islam and to just suppress Islam? Or, I'm not sure. Maybe they see the roots of English people. Maybe the roots of English people are just so intertwined with Christianity, and they just want this. They want this revival to reaffirm their identity. I'm not quite sure what it could be, but I think some of the Christian revival movement does feel a bit hollow. It does feel a bit superficial. It does feel like it's just to counteract, I don't know, the rise of Islam.
Well, I think it can vary from time to time, but I'll tell you something that's um, a number of years ago, some young Muslims that I knew, let's say they're probably maybe early 20s, and they talked about going to Westminster Cathedral for a liturgy, and the cathedral was magnificent, and then on the altar you had the choir, and and then but they said, but there was almost nobody there except for them. And one of them just talked about the fact that he really liked the UK. He said, and I'd gone back more than once, and I've seen that, and you know, as anyone who lives in the UK will note, there are lots of churches that have disappeared. Others, the building is still there, but there's nobody, or there are just very, very, very few. And I think in that kind of context, then dealing with other faiths, becomes more of an issue. It can be because there's almost a sense for many that religion really doesn't matter. So why should it's almost backwards to believe in religion? And and why should one respect the fact that other people may choose to either dress a little differently or to have different attitudes when it comes to abortion or transgender or whatever? You know what I mean? It'll what they do is they privilege their own position as being, well, my position is the most advanced and secular and open and etc. And on the other hand, I do think that there are areas where religion is coming back, for some. That is for some who are able to be, if you will, modern, secular in the sense of being embracing a pluralistic society. You see, secular itself is is a loaded term because very often when people say secular, it's anything that they want it to be over and against the other.
Mm.
Secular means, for example, if they're not religious and they're not, then it means then the others, then, really, if these people are really religious, this is, and it's, oh, maybe if it's their parents and grandparents that are that way, but oh, you mean you want to talk about people who are younger and who who can function, but when it comes to voting on some social policies may differ based on their faith or no faith. You know what I mean? But the faith thing can get in the way, and there's often people like to pigeonhole, and they don't understand. Um, um, you know, it, when we don't spend any time understanding the other, and then we're subject to believing whatever anybody else says.
Mm.
And so it'll be, well, this kind of Latin types are, whether they're from Latin America or they're from Italy or whatever, Latin types are more sexually active or they're more emotional or they're more, I mean, see, when I'm talking, hands and everything, right? My dad, just the opposite. My mom, like me, my father would have been this laid back person. He'd almost be the stereotype of the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Just a laid back while, maybe his son is getting upset about this or that,
Yeah.
And I think that we've gotten to that point, the fallout. But see, the interesting thing is when I switched from teaching theology and wanting to be a full-time theologian and studied actually initially Hinduism and Buddhism and then studied Islam, there were no jobs. When I finished my degree in the mid 1970s, there were no jobs. You see, my career came with the Iranian Revolution. I often say that I owe my career and my first Lexus to Ayatollah Khomeini. But up until that time, I got a job teaching other religions, world religions, but not Islam at all.
Mm.
And then when you get 9/11 on top of that, you know, okay, which was an incredibly horrific situation, the danger is instead of just saying these are religious folk who have gone over the top, these are extremists who are doing this in the name of religion, we forget that. See, now where it gets trickier now is that if you actually look at countries like the United States and some others, but certainly in the US, where you have, for example, let's say anti-Muslim and anti-white, but particularly anti-Muslim attitudes and anti-immigrant attitudes, a whole segment of those people are in fact Christian.
Mm.
They're Christian right.
Mm.
See, and so that it's not just that they're all white secularists, but in fact they are Christian right, and who who have no sense of the fact that they are products of basically historically of European Christianity that came here. All right, they're also people who don't respect native American Indians. They don't expect respect black people whose roots go back way before them. It's
Mm.
almost like America is this Christian right country, when in fact you would think that they'd have to be open to the fact that Native Americans would say, "Oh no, 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 no,
Not
you you're a foreign that came in, and then you slaughtered us and dominated us."
Mm.
And I think we forget that part of our history, and um, things have gotten worse rather than better. I mean, anti-Muslim racism. Think of it this way: look at all the headlines, even in major newspapers. Okay, you will see a concern and a and a rightful concern about anti-Semitism. Okay,
Mm.
anti-Semitism in terms of affecting politics, anti-Semitism in terms of um, um, impacting education or whatever. Okay, how often do you see similar articles with Islamophobia? You rarely even see the word used,
Mm.
or anti-Muslim racism. How often? And if we get quantitative about the people, you know, whether it's those that are suffering because of anti-Semitism or those that are suffering because of Islamophobia, the numbers are on both sides. But
Mm.
when you actually look at a good deal of media coverage, I almost never see uh, much concern about that at all. You look at hearings in Congress that they've been having. Okay, they should have on anti-Semitism on campus, but you don't hear in that same section in that same session concern about what's happening with regard to Muslims, Islamophobia, or having separate hearings. That doesn't happen. Why? Because we have people in the administration who don't recognize this phenomenon.
Mm. And not to justify any hate, but John, I do empathise with, again, the indigenous Brits or the Anglo-Saxon, because I do think a lot of the hate stems from this identity crisis they're having. I think in the past, 10 or so years, there's been a lot of talk about how bad the British Empire was and how evil British people were. And people like to say, they have no culture. And I don't agree with that. They have a very deep and rich culture. But when you constantly hear this, you know, I think this causes an identity crisis. And now I think indigenous Brits are starting to ask themselves those questions. Who are we? What does it mean to be British? And especially because a lot of the cities here, they're increasingly less English. And obviously, I do see myself as very British, but obviously my roots aren't from here. But those Anglo-Saxons, they're starting to ask themselves those questions, like what does it mean to be British? And they're trying to reaffirm themselves and their identity. So I think a lot of the hate is a product of them just trying to find out
Sure.
who they are. And again, when we went to the Tommy Robinson March, not everyone was actually anti-Islam. I think a lot of them just wanted to reassert their Britishness. This notion of we are the United Kingdom, we are a proud people. We always have been. We have this deep, rich history. We do have a strong sense of who we are. And I think a lot of those people just feel frustrated that they've been told for so long that their history isn't worth much and they're evil. And I think there's a reaction towards that. It's just to reassert Britishness. So
Sure.
I
I mean,
do empathize a tad.
yeah, no, I mean, I think, but I could tell you that, I started going to the UK probably in the 1970s and would go regularly, and I was invited to lecture at, been a number of places, but I won't mention this one university, and but it was quite a few years ago, and I was in the restaurant and I could hear this conversation going on. And and this guy had a posh British accent, and it was like heated, back and forth. And when I got up to leave, he was black. Okay. Now, given when I had been there, what I mean, in the early days, the odds, and there were a number of other people that were, I mean, I saw the change in kind of complexion, when I, and And so when I then think about, for example, I'll talk about Northern European countries like Sweden and Denmark. For many people in a Sweden or Denmark, they have a whole history of even if their faith is no longer even that strong within the country, of being a Christian country, a white country. In some of the countries, one in which most of them are blonde, blonde hair, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so then suddenly you're now seeing, the other coming in there. You're also, though, letting go of some of your own history in a
Mm.
certain way. And then the danger is that one winds up, looking and saying, look at that, that person. There's, let's say, an incident of uh, uh, marital violence, and they'll say, well, they're Latins or they're Italian types. They've got this kind of temperament. But you'll want to say, if you actually look at the statistics in terms of, violence in marriages, it can come from people who are not, you know, but it stands out. I mean, I look at the Downton Abbey phenomenon, and I'm now watching this for the second time. Not because I choose to watch it for the second time, but it's a family sort of situation. But in fact, the extent to which that not only got picked up outside, but also inside, and the history that that it's showing, you know. But you sit back and you're looking at a very uh, by today's standards, a fairly authoritarian kind of context, and a context of the wealthy versus the majority of the worker population. So you've got these big social changes. Uh, I I think that today we just have to be more and more aware. When demonstrations and concern about the loss of one's history, the loss of what one, cherishes, that's perfectly legitimate. But when violence becomes part of the situation, and when you only blame the other,
Mm.
then that's very problematic.
Mm.
One has to really look very closely at, what does the data tell us when it comes to, you know, crime, et cetera. And I think we have these sort of um, what used to be stereotypes when people engaged each other as other, and they'd say, well, you're just emotional, or when I first got my first job, the lady downstairs wanted to talk to me, and she saw my name, and she was kind of, she was trying to carefully sort of figure out who I was. And what she was concerned about deep down was I Puerto Rican? Because in those days, it was a big thing in that area about Puerto Rican. They were called Spics. And for me, it was incredible. I was relieved when she was delighted because I was Italian American, because I had lived in a context in which I often would be in context with people who were um, white Anglo-Saxon in background, whether it's British, Irish, or whatever, and their stereotype of Italians and what we were like and the kinds of things that they felt free to say
Mm.
uh, was amazing to me. Now, this was back 50 years, but I mean, it was amazing to me. And now we're dealing with the new situation where you've had not only a big influx of immigrants, but you've had immigrants that were there for years, and now they're second, third generation. And
Mm.
for some white people who uh, um, maybe um, aren't as fortunate uh, economically, et cetera, they're looking and saying, really? Do we need a mayor with a Muslim name? You know what I mean? In our city? Or do we need, and this thing now occurring with regard to New York,
Mm.
and you know what I mean? And instead of looking at the social policy of the person, wanting to say, well, wait a minute, though, he's a Muslim. So that could be a problem.
Mm. Because people always say that, America is like it's a country of migrants, which I guess it is true to some degree. But then, do you know what I found very interesting is that you've also had this anti-migrant rhetoric throughout the years. I mean,
Yeah.
today it's anti-Islam, but prior to that, it was anti-Italian Americans and probably anti-Irish
Yeah,
Americans.
my father could remember when he could pass a store and it would say, no black people or Italians, you
Wow.
know.
Did you
The,
also experience some of them?
I experienced yeah, a certain kind of stereotyping. Yeah, an offensive stereotyping. Yeah, definitely.
I find
Um,
that so interesting because our generation that, grew up in, the 21st century, that this is like a past generation, and we now see just white, black, Latino, these kind of like, Muslim,
mm,
whatever. And we forget, oh my God, this happened between white and white people. Like, and I guess does that mean it's just human nature? When you talk about how we just jump to conclusions, even with the Charlie Kirk death, it was interesting to see how, we don't know anything about the guy, right? But people say, hey, he's a lefty. And even at the talking about this guy, he didn't say it outright, but he was said, oh, isn't it funny? Like the second Charlie Kirk started talking about like Islam and Muslims, this happens, So
mm.
everyone jumps to conclusions. And it's, talking about Mamdani and these things that are happening in Sadiq Khan here in London. It's like people, yeah, in this identity crisis, people associate like, in America, I feel like they would never elect, a non-Christian president, or the leader of the country is kind of representing the image of the country, right? So going back to what you were saying is that those people say, well, looking back, we are a white country, we're a Christian country. What can we say to those people? Because on one side, we're like, okay, maybe you're right, but then identity changes, history goes on. What do we say to those people to maybe try to bridge the gap?
Well, I think that what we have to, it seems to me, what we have to cling to the extent that we can, is if you will, the documents that we have historically, whether it's in the U.S., it's the Constitution, etc. Okay, but even there, if you look at the U.S. now, a lot of what the courts um, allowed in the past with this current Supreme Court, a fair amount of that is getting thrown out. You know, but I think what we have to do is to try to cling not just to the sense of history that we had in the past, but the present. And so, for example, one of the problems that we've run into in the U.S. and certainly in education in the U.S., et cetera, is recognizing the extent to which slavery played such an incredible role in America and what that meant for generations of black people who were descendant of slaves. How that impacted them, how that affected them, in terms of their mobility, even when when in fact we did away with slavery legally, if you were first or second generation and still living in a white society, and you were coming from a disenfranchised a family, economically, etc., that becomes, you know, we've had to address that. Georgetown has developed a whole policy in looking at its history and at a point at which, when it was felt necessary, several Jesuit administrators wound up selling, had slaves and sold them, and at times families were broken up, etc. Georgetown has gotten very much involved in studying that history and developing economic responses in terms of um, recruitment, etc. And our society needs to do that kind of thing. But I can remember 50 years ago being in New England and going to a beach with a group and being told by some friends, now, you know, you may find that people may come up and start questioning you, because certainly in the summertime, I have a kind of Latin look and complexion, but in the summertime, I get much darker. And I remember when my parents moved from an Italian neighborhood in Brooklyn, we moved to Jersey City, and we were in a very non-Italian, and people would stop me in the area where I lived, but they didn't know that, and they'd say, "Oh, hello, what's your name? And where do you come from? Like, where do you live?" Because their presumption was you don't live here. You don't live in this neighborhood. You're somehow, foreign. Um, and there were all kinds of presuppositions. Just and the stereotyping when people can't understand why you're religious.
Mm.
Having been grown up as a devout Catholic, having been in a monastery for a number of years, um, I would have people who were people that I kind of knew who would. I remember one time having a conversation, and I knew the whole conversation was what these guys really wanted to know was, really? Are you really celibate? Are you really, how do you deal with that? But it took them a long time to even want to say that. It was because this for them was inconceivable
Mm.
that a male, would you know would would opt, to have a vow of celibacy the rest of their life. But they, or even from their point of view, it would be they couldn't understand how a healthy 22-year-old was still, you know, still thinking to follow this lifestyle, you know? And then even when you dealt with people who were either not Catholic or people who were non-believers, they couldn't, they just, they did had no respect at the end of the day for one's faith as a Catholic. They just felt this is abnormal. Males shouldn't be like this. You know what I mean? Should you have a religious life where you've got these women who are all veiled as nuns and they're all celibate, for the rest of their life, and you've got, these males, functioning this way? Those customs were seen as for and I wasn't totally aware of that because I grew up, yes, in cosmopolitan New York, but I grew up in a totally Italian, as I used to say, Italian paradise. For
Mm.
as far as I could walk as a little kid, I was in Italian neighborhoods. A bit of a stereotype, but what did people want to talk to me about, though? At times, my friends who were not Italian, they wanted to talk to me about the mafia,
Oh gosh.
and they wanted to know how much I knew about the mafia.
Mm.
And my neighborhood was my neighborhood, a mafia neighborhood. Like, what I mean? If I'd said to them, well, my uncle Luigi was, my uncle, you know, my uncle Tony Soprano was, they would have believed anything that I said, with that stereotype. So yeah, no, it's,
Mm.
How, because that's, I watched the video that, on your career, and that's one of the, you had so many impressive things, establishing, with the Georgetown after like a 20 million investment, to establish, Muslim Christian relations and much more. But one of the things that, surprised me is that you spent, was it 10 years in a monastery or an
I
extensive.
went, I went, I left home at the age of 14 to become a Capuchin Franciscan, and I left at the age of 24. I had taken um, uh, vows for life of poverty, uh, um, and obedience, etc. But then I was able to have those vows reversed, as it
Wow.
were. But I had taken initial vows for 3 years, and then I took vows for life of yeah.
How did that experience prepare you for, this next chapter of your life, this next mission? Because, 10 years of, being very dedicated to this faith
Mm.
and waking up, 5 a.m. and eating silently and prayer. How did that shape you to be on the mission you are now?
Yeah,
And
it
so,
was
John, I wondered, did you struggle once you came out? Was it hard to attach to certain things once you've left the very?
sure. I mean, getting used to, I mean, coming out and you go for a job, right? So I go to a corporation, Prudential Life Insurance Company, management training, and they have an application. So then they ask you things like, in effect, so what did you do in college? What kind of, so I had to say things like I was in the glee club rather than the choir. Or I had to, what I mean? Say I played basketball. Well, I played basketball, but I wasn't on a basketball team. I mean, there were a lot of questions of, as it were, normal life that you would expect that somebody, would deal with. So getting used to that the whole lifestyle of being out, of dating, but also of dealing with people who, when they heard of my background, they didn't know what to do with it. I was in I had a job at Prudential working primarily. I was being trained in management with mostly young women, etc. And uh, but when people heard what my background was, they didn't know how to kind of handle that. Now, when you get to the religion thing, the thing that really was really interesting was I went to Temple University to get a PhD in Catholic theology. I had
Mm.
gotten my master's degree. I was teaching at a Catholic women's college, and but one of the requirements was it was a new religion department. You had to major in one religion and minor in two. Okay, which turned out to be really great. But initially, you had to take a course for a year on world religions. And I suddenly got interested in Hinduism.
Mm.
And I just decided, well, that's what I would do. And I went to the
What
chair.
interested you about Hinduism?
I, I had a tremendous professor from India. I never realized till years later that he actually was very prominent, etc. Okay. I just was fascinated, I, you know, by Hinduism in it was such a rich tradition. It's uh, it's its notions of the role of meditation within Hinduism, at least in the Hinduism I was doing, and I also was taking a course in Zen Buddhism. Their emphasis on meditation was much different. The richness of Hinduism and its culture, uh, in terms of when you think of how India developed uh, its monuments, its religious texts. Some of them I really liked. Um, and the chairman of the department said, "Well, that's fine, but I think you need to take a course in Islam. We've just hired a Muslim, and so take at least one course." And I said, "No, thank you," because I want to finish my degree. Plus, I knew nothing about Muslims. I saw a movie called The Exodus, which I thought was historical, and it wasn't. It was very anti-Arab and anti-Muslim. And so, so I thought, why, But so he made me take the course. Now, what was unique and what really led to the rest of my life transformation was that the professor that I had was a Palestinian who had studied at Harvard as well as Indiana for his degrees, spoke four languages. He was a devout Muslim. But what was unique was, unlike in those days, um, um, any classroom situation, in my classroom situation, the majority of the class, a significant majority, were Muslim. But the only reason for that was that my professor every year would go and raise money in the Muslim world for scholarships so that these Muslim students would come and they had to major not in Islam, but in another religion, and then they could minor, if they wanted, etc. So here I was, that this religion came alive in that I wasn't just reading a book, a textbook, or even having just this professor saying what he wanted to say. But whenever we talked and discussed, I had Muslims, fellow graduate students who came from Egypt to Southeast Asia. And so I would see the faith alive, not only in the text, but how they described the text, how they interpreted the text, how they viewed it. Now, it also had some kind of initial funny sort of situations where we had an exam, and one of the fellows who was from Pakistan said, "Could he borrow my book?" And I said, "Fine." I said, "But the exam is, let's say, next Tuesday, and I need it, by 2 days before." And he said, "Inshallah, God willing." But we continued the conversation. And then finally I said to him, you know, I hope you understand this, but 3 times you've said to me, when I say I need the book for me to study, inshallah, God willing. I said, 1 inshallah I could handle. 3 inshallah I began to worry. Now, one of the interesting things is that in fact, you actually have a situation where there are a lot of Muslim males and females, but particularly sometimes some I remember one woman who saying to me, when I ask my husband to do something, he says, "Yes, inshallah, I'll do it." And I say to him, "Inshallah, you're going to do it, or inshallah, you're not going to do it." And a friend of mine laughed and said, "Actually, it's kind of popularly known that when people use it a lot, that they're really kind of saying there's no guarantee I'm going to do it." But the religion came alive for me in that kind of context. And the more that I read about it, I had the stereotype again of the Exodus, that these Arabs were, these terrible people, and that was not a historical book; it was a novel, and um, and so then by coincidence, I had an opportunity to be invited to study in the UK, not in the UK, in the Middle East at this British school, Middle East Center for Arab Studies in Lebanon. And then when I needed to get a job, of course, there were no jobs. There was only one job in the country that I was able to get, and that was to teach at Holy Cross and to teach world religions. There was no advertised job to just teach Islam. I actually probably, and I took the job at Holy Cross probably in 71, 72. It wasn't until the Iranian Revolution that I actually could then really teach. There were no book contracts. I'd write for book contracts, and if 3 or 4 people answered, they'd say great idea, but no market. Because if you went to a bookstore, you'd have all kinds of books on Christianity and even a whole section on Judaism, and you might find a book that would be a copy of the Quran or a book of the Quran and then one other book. There was none of that, and then it was the Iranian Revolution, and then suddenly I had all kinds of book contracts, government, uh, the U.S. government had a program where they would send people out, scholars like who were lawyers or geographers, and they'd go to countries and lecture in different countries in the libraries, the American Library in different cities. And for the first time, they decided to do something on Islam, and then that opened me up so that I then had all of this experience in a variety of Muslim countries. But I was lucky in that because when I was studying with Muslim students, um, things came alive. And when there were stereotypes of Muslims, I could automatically say, well, wait a second, that's not the way any of the people I know are. You know what I mean? When somebody would say something like, well, a lot of Muslims are this or that, uh, uh, and it would be like negative type stuff. They were the way you would normally say normally Christian or whatever, um, and um, and so that then led to to the kind of career that I had that I would have never had. Absolutely never had. The line I always use is that my parents rarely got to see me when I was speaking, but one time they were in an audience, and after it, somebody said to my mother, "What do you think of when you see your son there?" And she said, "At least he has a job. At least he has a job." And then they, um, "Did John read a lot?" And she said, "All my sons read, and in the summer in particular, they had to read books." And they said, "Did John like read a lot of books?" He said, "Well, John needed books with a lot of pictures in them." So that was also my, I became a lot of what I accomplished was not what I would have normally chosen. I wasn't like a bookworm. I wasn't, you know, um, it just sort of, it happened.
Mm.
But anyway, so the reason I said you want to edit this is just I have no problem with what I say, um, if you contextualize it, you know what I mean? But
Mm.
there are things that I'm being very quick and loose when I'm saying it, and I'm very conscious uh, of having to worry about the audience because, for example, when 9/11 occurred, you had almost immediately Campus Watch came out, put out by Daniel Pipes, and that sort of listed academics in tier one, tier two, tier three, accusing us of somehow being responsible, for
Were you on that list?
hmm?
Were you on that list?
I was in the first tier.
Oh,
Bloody
wow.
hell. Wow.
Yeah, I mean that's um, in fact, one of the things that again, the thing I'm going to say now, I don't want you to print, but there was a book put out called "101 Most Dangerous Professors." I was in that too, with great pride. I'm glad, but I always say I never refer to that because he never ranked us, and so God forbid I was number 98. I wouldn't want anybody to even know that I was not at least let me be in the first 10 or the first 15. No, but that's where you really saw how suddenly it was like, um, because I don't like what you say. I don't deal with, what you say. Uh, I then stereotype it. And you see that going on now. If you look at the investigation of universities in the US, if you've been looking at it, uh, you've got our Congress, fine. If they want to look at the issue of anti-Semitism and anti-Semitism on campus, fine. But do you see them holding any hearings on anti-Muslim racism and Islamophobia?
Mm.
They talk about uh, things that are said on a campus, let's say, or somebody may have been disrespected or whatever. Uh, are they concerned about the fact that there are situations where you have Muslim students who are disrespected, pushed, maybe spit at the way maybe somebody else in reverse did X? In other words, there's a one-sided uh, approach in all the hearings. They do not bring. It's just a one-sided approach,
I always
and
wonder
notion
why.
that
I always
hmm?
wonder why there was that discrepancy, like especially in the US, where it seems like the Christians and the Jews are, somewhat aligned, I guess, or in terms of government or whatever, like that it's friendly, but Islam is completely to the side, and you know, looking at it just historically, the basics, you would think it's the opposite, right? We mentioned how your Muslim friend can't talk bad about Jesus because that's
Mm.
a holy figure, while the Jews killed Jesus. So you would think it would be opposite, but why is it so that it's just one way towards Islam?
Well, I mean, you had um, you had preachers uh, uh, Jerry Falwell, a whole mess of Christian preachers several decades ago who were very right wing, born again, and very anti-Muslim. You see it also reflected in the current ambassador to Israel. Look up his background. He's an ordained minister. He then became the governor of Arkansas. Um, his daughter is now the governor. She had been the spokesperson for Donald Trump in his first term. When he went to speak, when he came back as ambassador just recently to speak at Congress, um, um, he didn't use the word Israel, or he used um, biblical biblical terms that made it clear that he was avoiding having to. He has said that there's no such thing as Palestine or Palestinians.
Mm.
Okay, he has said that, and he's been made the ambassador to this country. He's totally uncritical supporter of the Netanyahu regime. Uh, totally, and it's always been, his statements have always been very anti-Muslim. You can go back again 30 years ago and have um, a former Speaker of the House of Representatives warning about Sharia when people didn't even know what Sharia was, and saying somehow that, introducing that as like a fear and a threat. And you look at a number of members of the cabinet. So, it's this is the funny thing. And so in your own country, it's not just that we have people who are not well educated, you know, and it's not that we just have people who are not people of faith or whatever. We've got this mix of people who can be really well educated and even can be people of faith, but can be um, um, very narrow-minded
Mm.
and prejudiced.
I had a mate who was just in Washington, and I asked him, "All right, so how was your time there?" And he said it was horrible. There's so much animosity. People are just on edge. No one is smiling. Even when you go out to have a good time, there's still this sense of despondency surrounding them, and the world just feels increasingly more divided and divided. And yeah, I think spreading a message of unity is like so important. And on that topic, do you think, or is there anything that makes you optimistic about, this clash between the Judeo-Christian world and the Islamic world? Do you think there's anything that can sort of reconcile the two?
No, I mean, I think I don't see it in that way as a clash between those worlds. I think it's a clash between people who will uh, who come from certain traditions, um, but it doesn't mean that they represent. For example, I don't think uh, that all American Jews or just European Jews or whatever, that all of them would be, are uncritically supportive of the Netanyahu government uh, and uh, uh, and um, and 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 its policies in terms of and the genocide that's occurred.
Mm.
Um, um, I think that, um, but I do think that the situation is so um, it's gotten so tense, and and the rhetoric has gotten so at times dangerous in terms of when you say, well, whose rhetoric? It's when you wind up having rhetoric that comes not only from um, you know these sort of super right wing folks and groups, but comes from people who are otherwise um, more intelligent, better educated, etc., but who are now um, either anti-Semitic or Islamophobic.
Mm.
I mean that's just there. It's gotten completely out of control. The fact that we can live in a world and watch, I think it's within a month or no more than 2 months, but see Israel basically its planes I think went into 8 different countries, bombing. I mean, and whose bombs are they dropping? In
Mm.
general, American-made bombs, etc. I mean that kind of uh, that makes you worry. And when you see, um, in some cases, the extent to which people in significant political positions um, um, espouse um, um, this kind of worldview, um, this clash of civilizations worldview,
Mm.
uh, it's that's really troublesome because you're not just talking about, again, you know, it, people who you say, oh, well, they're ignorant, or they're not well educated, or they, et cetera, et cetera. That's not the case. In general, the people that are in the driver's seat in many situations uh, are not really thinking about what they're saying and what they're doing.
Mm.
And so the terrible killing of, you know, just that just occurred last week, uh, regardless of what side he was on, it just shows you what can happen. Now, some people want to immediately say, that's the left that makes that possible. You want to say, look, a great deal of the violence, certainly in America, has come from the right.
Mm.
And a lot of it's come from the Christian right. So, you know what I mean? And I think that that's what we don't realize is we're 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 creating a context in which um, solving things, we almost legitimate solving situations by turning to violence,
Mm.
uh, uh, or solving them by discriminating against, people, uh, you know, uh, and it's a giant step backwards.
Mm.
Whether one agrees with, for example, the question of abortion or transgender, etc. The question is, what's the nature of the governments that we've had? What's the nature of our constitutions? What's the nature of what was the trajectory looking like in terms of the ability to practice political pluralism?
Mm.
You know, uh, that's being eroded. I think uh, quite a bit, and and where do we go from there?
Yeah.
We're no longer looking. In the old days, when by old days I mean like even in the last, I don't know what, let's say up until about 20 years ago, people would always be thinking, oh well, the real irrational violent stuff that goes on in those other countries. It goes on in Africa, it goes on in parts of the Arab world, it goes on in uh, and here we have um, American versus American. Very often they can have the same educational background. Some of the most far right dangerous people are people that actually have excellent educations. Have gone to a top university for their degree and then gone to Harvard Law School for their degree, and um, and we even see that issue on our Supreme Court now. So I think that it's we're in for some dangerous times. You
Mm.
know, a lot of people are very concerned, and a lot of people just don't. They just keep their head down. That shouldn't be the case.
Mm.
Uh,
John,
I mean,
I also wondered, are you still a Catholic?
yes. Well, I if I'm in a context where I find that the Catholic Church um, is reasonably open and progressive. That is, locally, and wherever I am. Otherwise, I would have no problem going to Episcopal, Episcopal church, etc. But yeah, I'm Catholic, and of course now we have an American who's Pope. But yeah, we've gone in directions that I've done a lot of podcasts. This is like the sixth one in the last 4 weeks, and I have another one coming with the University of Exeter. But this has been the most
We have
open
a
and
friend there.
dangerous.
What was it, John? I didn't quite catch that last thing you said.
This has been the most open and dangerous one.
Mm.
Okay, I better get going because if I
Thank
say
you
anything,
so much, Josh, for speaking with
John,
us.
an absolute privilege to be able to speak with you. Thank you.
yeah, just let me take a look at least to see,
Of course, we'll send it to you.
I don't want you coming to visit me in prison someplace.
Or maybe you'll come to visit us in the UK.
I'm actually coming to the UK. I've already been invited to come there, and if you guys don't behave, I can get some of my mafia people to take care of you and your loved ones. Anyway, and you can put that out if you like. It's okay.
Well, thank you so much, and who knows, maybe we'll get to speak to you again sometime soon.
Yeah, inshallah. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Take care.
All right, take care. Bye bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.